If there are no further points of order, we come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Mr. Damien Moore?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given for me to bring in a bill to make provision about postal voting at elections. It is a great privilege to make a representation of this bill in the mother of all parliaments, in one of the world's great democracies. The representation of the people, or postal handling bill, escalates two of Sir Eric Pickles' recommendations made in his review of electoral fraud, which he undertook as part of his remit as the government's anti-corruption champion. There is no threat more insidious to a democratic society than electoral fraud, and it is almost beyond belief that so many allegations of fraudulent behaviour have been made during recent council, mayoral and general elections. It is clear that unscrupulous and devious people are intent on subverting the confidence of the electorate and damaging the sanctity of our ancient democracy. The events that occurred during the 2014 Tower Hamlets mayoral election are mercifully rare, but they showed us that our democracy cannot be taken for granted. We need to accept that our truth-based electoral system is susceptible to fraudulent practices. International intergovernmental organisations such as the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights have raised their concerns over what they perceive as to be vulnerabilities within the United Kingdom's electoral systems, and it is essential that we act now. Of course, fighting corruption and electoral fraud has benefits beyond protecting democracy and the suffrage of our citizens. Crime begets crime, while malfeasance and corruption, once they put down roots in an organisation or institution, are very hard to eradicate. An individual who has undermined democratic process and attained elected office through casuistic means is unlikely to maintain ethical standards in office, but rather lead to recidivistic tendencies to the detriment of those that he or she represents. The law, as is, currently allows a voter to hand in their own and other people's completed and sealed postal ballots to a polling station on polling day, or to a returning officer on any day before polling day that is deemed to be too close to polling day to ensure that the Postal Service will be able to execute the delivery of the postal ballot in time. The Electoral Commission has introduced a code of conduct that essentially states that no political activist should handle another person's postal ballot papers. However, the code is not enshrined in law. At present, political activists and campaigners are still legally permitted to handle and deliver an unlimited number of postal ballots to polling stations. Although the simple act of handling in another person's completed and sealed ballot could be completely innocuous, I am certain that most members of this House will be at least familiar with the concept of ballot harvesting. This practice involves political activists gathering up ballot papers, sometimes in their hundreds, and delivering them to polling stations on behalf of the local electorate. Because these completed ballots are often handed into polling stations on polling day, there is rarely a chance to ensure that they have not been tampered with or indeed fraudulently completed by another party. As Sir Eric Pickles noted in his report on the electoral fraud, Securing the Ballot, the lack of statutory ban on the handling of postal ballots by political activists leaves scope for the integrity of the voting system to be undermined. Frankly, it is impossible to disagree. In recent years, perhaps cultivated by an increasingly partisan politics, there has been an escalation in instances of intimidations and threats against politicians after greater schisms in politics than ever before, expressed in the basest way and, of course, with increasing concerns of corruption within our electoral system. Although this bill seeks to allay the possibility of postal ballot fraud, I also hope it will go some way of putting the dignity back into democracy. It is my hope that members on all sides of this House will recognise this bill would introduce pragmatic, sensible legislation into the electoral legal canon. I also believe that parliamentarians should be at the forefront of electoral reform, helping to ensure that opportunities of malpractice and criminal behaviour are eradicated. The bill will implement a ban on the handling of complete, incomplete or blank postal ballot papers by persons seeking to benefit a candidate or political party. These include candidates, agents and their staff, political party officers, members, activists and representatives of pressure groups associated with political parties. Furthermore, the bill will also apply to people or organisations campaigning for or against a political candidate at an election, or indeed those people or organisations campaigning for or against a particular outcome at a referendum. It also enforces a reasonable limit on the number of postal ballots that any individual can hand in on behalf of other voters at a polling station or to a returning officer on polling day. Any individual who is registered to vote at an election will be able to hand in no more than the prescribed number of postal ballots that are not their own. We envisage that regulations made under the enabling power in the bill will set this threshold at a maximum of 2. Individuals will be able to exercise their own right to vote, or indeed be able to hand in their own sealed postal ballot in addition to the others that they are returning. This is an important element of the bill, for it is not always impossible to identify the aforementioned subterfuge whereby a party affiliate or campaigner is handling postal ballots and delivering them into the polling stations or returning officers. It is rare that an individual will be able to be identified as being part of a political group or as being an activist, and therefore applying a limit to the number of postal votes delivered to polling stations or returning officers for absolutely everybody without exception is necessary. And what of the penalties for those who seek to undermine the will of the electorate through fraudulent behaviour? It is imperative that we enforce stringent sanctions against that, provide a deterrent to anyone considering committing an electoral offence, deviating from the new measures concerning postal ballot handling. The bill will introduce a new offence. Individuals, specifically party affiliates or campaigners, who are banned from handling postal ballot papers belonging to someone else and do not complete the criteria for exemption will face the following penalties: a prison sentence of up to 2 years, a fine or prison sentence and a fine following conviction or indictment. Alternatively, in the instance of a summary conviction, up to 6 months imprisonment or a fine on summary conviction. There are, of course, exceptions and extenuating circumstances, and the bill will include an exemption for those individuals who are politically or campaign affiliates, but who are acting on behalf of a family member or another voter for whom they are a carer. This is critical, as while the law must seek to impede fraud and malpractice in elections and referendums, it is equally important that no one must feel as though they are unable to exercise their democratic right to vote. We must ensure that regulations provide polling station staff with the means to examine the intentions and provenance of anyone purporting to hand in someone else's postal ballot papers. I believe that the best way of doing this is by enabling polling station staff to provide the individual in question with a prescribed form that, through a series of basic questions, will enable polling station staff to determine whether that voter is permitted to hand in or handle another's postal ballot papers. Hopefully, the form will provide certain structure to the process, and instances of calumny during innocuous visits to the polling station will be rare. Guidance will be established to ensure the polling station staff are well equipped to deal with the new requirements placed on through this bill. It is important to recognise that these measures have been carefully considered, and whilst it is essential that polling station staff do not look askance at voters who enter the polling stations and voting booths on polling day, I believe that this bill will enable greater scrutiny of possible electoral misdeeds. Abstention from voting has often been too high in the United Kingdom, but last year's general election did have the highest voter turnout for 25 years. I am certain that as parliamentarians we can encourage political engagement from a sometimes vote-shy public, whilst also examining the ways and means of making elections and referendums as fair and as free as possible. Indeed, I would hope that this bill would be an apropos to a wider movement of electoral transparency, decorum in campaigning, public engagement with our democracy, and perhaps most crucially of all, the right for all people to engage in political campaigning without intimidation and the threat of violence. This bill introduces basic changes that will go some way to addressing the perceptions of wrongdoing with a view to securing a fairer electoral system, and I hope that my parliamentary colleagues will consider it with the candour and thoughtfulness that I have come to expect from them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Mr Simon Clarke, Vicky Ford, Eddie Hughes, Andrew Bowie, Giles Watling, Julia Lopez, Lee Rowley and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Mr Damien Moore.
Postal Voting Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 15th of June.
Friday the 15th of June. The clerk